The aisle went silent the moment the words landed. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from that seat." Not raised, not shouted, calm, polished, delivered with the kind of authority that assumes obedience before it's even requested. The first-class cabin of the Horizon Atlantic flight from Atlanta to Denver froze mid-motion. A champagne flute hovered inches from a woman's lips. A newspaper rustled once, then stilled. The soft hum of conditioned air seemed suddenly louder, intrusive. The man in seat 1, Charlie, did not move. Charles Whitman sat upright, hands resting loosely on his thighs. His jacket, a dark navy blazer with frayed cuffs, was folded carefully beside him. No carry-on overhead, no visible urgency, just a stillness that felt deliberate, measured. He looked up slowly. The flight attendant standing over him was a woman in her early 50s, silver streaks pulled tight into a bun. Her name tag read Linda Harris. Her posture was impeccable, shoulders squared, chin lifted just enough to signal control. Her eyes, however, did not meet his. They hovered somewhere above his forehead, as if acknowledging his presence without granting him recognition. "There's been a change in seating assignments," she continued. "We need this seat available." Charles glanced down at the boarding pass in his hand. "First class, seat 1, Charlie," his name printed clearly in black ink. "I checked in yesterday," he said. His voice was low, even, the kind that carried weight without trying to. There was no issue. Linda's lips tightened, a polite line stretched thin. She shifted her weight slightly, blocking the aisle with practiced ease. This was not her first time doing this. "This is not a ticketing issue," she replied. "It's a service adjustment." Service adjustment. The phrase hung there clean and bloodless, designed to mean everything and nothing at once. Behind her, another attendant, younger, maybe early 30s, hovered near the galley curtain. He kept glancing between Charles and Linda, fingers flexing against the tablet in his hand. Nervous energy. The kind that came from watching a line about to be crossed and knowing you were too junior to stop it. Charles felt it then. Not anger, not yet. Something older, heavier. A familiar tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the airplane cabin. He had felt it before. Decades earlier, in a roadside diner outside Birmingham. His father, still wearing his army jacket, still walking with a slight limp from a knee that never healed right, being asked if he was sure he belonged at that counter. The same tone, the same careful politeness, the same refusal to say the real reason out loud. Charles looked past Linda now, scanning the cabin. Every other passenger in first class was white, middle-aged, well-dressed, comfortable in the unspoken assurance that no one would ever ask them to justify their presence in this space. A man across the aisle caught Charles's eye for a brief second, then looked away quickly, pretending to adjust his cufflinks. Linda cleared her throat. "Sir," she said again, sharper this time, "if you'll gather your things." Charles did not stand. Instead, he asked a question. "Who authorized this change?" The young attendant behind her stiffened. His eyes widened just a fraction. Linda's jaw tightened. "That information isn't necessary." Necessary. Another word carefully chosen. Charles nodded once, slowly, as if filing it away. His gaze returned to her face, finally locking with her eyes. For a split second, something flickered there. Recognition, maybe, or uncertainty. It vanished quickly, replaced by professional detachment. "There's a seat for you in the main cabin," Linda continued. "We'll assist you." A man 2 rows back shifted uncomfortably. Someone exhaled long and loud, the sound of a decision being made not to intervene. Charles picked up his blazer, smoothed it once between his fingers. He could feel his pulse now, steady but firm, like a drum beat beneath his ribs. He was acutely aware of the cameras mounted above the aisle, the small red lights, always watching, always recording. He thought of the internal reports he had skimmed months ago, complaints categorized as customer sensitivity issues, data anomalies, outliers, all smoothed into neat charts and percentages. He had questioned them then, not hard enough. "Sir," Linda said, her patience thinning, "I don't want to escalate this." The word escalate was almost ironic. This was already an escalation, just one disguised as routine. Charles stood. The movement rippled through the cabin like a held breath finally released. The younger attendant stepped back instinctively, clearing space. As Charles lifted his bag from the seat, his eyes drifted to the galley curtain. A woman stood half hidden there, late 40s, dark skin, deep lines around her eyes that spoke of long hours and longer memories. She wore the same uniform as Linda, but her posture was different, less rigid, more tired. She met Charles's gaze and held it. In that look, there was something unmistakable: shame and apology. Charles nodded to her once, small, almost imperceptible. He stepped into the aisle. As Linda guided him forward, her hand hovered near his elbow without touching, control without contact. The walk felt longer than it should have. Each step echoed with the soft thud of his shoes against the carpet, a sound too loud in the quiet cabin. They passed row 3, row 4. A man leaned back, watching openly now, curiosity edging into discomfort. A woman whispered something to her husband. He shook his head, eyes forward. At the curtain dividing first class from the rest of the plane, Linda stopped. "Here," she said, gesturing. Beyond the curtain, the lighting shifted, harsher, brighter. The air smelled faintly of reheated coffee and cleaning solution. Rows tightened, space contracted. Charles stepped through. A child kicked the back of a seat somewhere. Someone laughed too loudly. Life compressed. Linda pointed to a middle seat near the wing. 18 Delta, she said. Charles paused, hand on the seat back. He did not sit yet. He turned to face her. "I want you to remember something," he said quietly. His voice did not rise, but it cut clean through the ambient noise. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Linda's eyes flashed. "Sir, please take your seat." Charles held her gaze for one more second. Then he sat. The belt clicked into place. A final sound of compliance. Linda turned sharply and walked back toward the front, heels striking the floor with renewed force. The younger attendant followed, glancing back once, his expression troubled. As the plane began to taxi, Charles stared out the window at the slow movement of ground crews and luggage carts. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. Older now, 64 years carved into his face, lines earned, not given. He exhaled. This was not an incident. It was evidence. And for the first time in a long time, Charles Whitman allowed himself to think the unthinkable. Maybe the company he built no longer recognized him. Or worse, maybe it never truly saw people like him at all. The seatbelt sign clicked on with a dry chime, and the cabin settled into its artificial calm. Charles Whitman did not move. He sat in 18 Delta, shoulders squared, eyes forward, breathing slow and controlled. The narrow armrests pressed into his ribs. The man to his left smelled of cologne and anxiety. The woman on his right kept glancing at him, then away, as if proximity itself carried risk. The engines began their low, patient growl. From the corner of his eye, Charles saw Linda Harris pause at the curtain. She looked back once, just long enough to confirm he was seated where she had put him. Her expression did not change. Satisfaction was too strong a word. It was closer to reassurance. Order restored. She disappeared into first class. The plane rolled forward. Tires hummed. A distant thump echoed as the aircraft aligned with the runway. The sound carried Charles backward in time, to a hangar in St. Louis decades earlier, where he had stood on cold concrete floors watching mechanics work through the night, believing airplanes were honest machines. You treated them right, and they carried you where you needed to go. People, he had learned later, were not machines. As the aircraft lifted, his stomach dipped slightly. He welcomed the sensation. Physical grounding, proof he was still here, still present, still paying attention. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out his phone. The screen lit his face briefly, a pale rectangle in the dim cabin. No signal yet. Expected. He slid the phone back without checking anything. Patience. 2 rows ahead, A young black man in a charcoal suit sat rigidly, hands clasped tight between his knees. His tie was knotted perfectly, too perfectly. The kind of precision born from knowing you would be judged the moment you slipped. A flight attendant passed him without making eye contact. Behind Charles, an older Latina woman shifted uncomfortably, murmuring to the man beside her in Spanish. He squeezed her hand. Neither looked toward the front of the plane. Charles closed his eyes for a moment. This was the pattern. Not chaos, not overt hostility, efficiency, quiet removal, clean explanations, no raised voices, no slurs, just outcomes that always seemed to fall the same way. The plane leveled off. The seatbelt sign chimed again. Conversation resumed in cautious fragments. A beverage cart rattled somewhere up front. Footsteps approached. Charles opened his eyes. The older woman he had seen near the galley earlier stood beside his row now. She wore the same uniform as Linda, but her movements lacked the sharpness. Years of service had worn down the edges. Her name tag read, Ruth Daniels. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she pretended to adjust the overhead vent above the row. Her hand trembled slightly. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, eyes still on the vent. Charles turned his head just enough to hear her without inviting attention. "For what?" he asked. Ruth swallowed. "For how that looked. For how it was handled." A pause. "For letting it happen." Charles studied her profile. The fine lines, the exhaustion tucked behind professionalism. "Did you order it?" he asked. Ruth shook her head almost imperceptibly. "No." "Did Linda?" Another pause, longer this time. "Linda enforces," Ruth said carefully. "She doesn't design." "Who does?" Charles asked. Ruth's jaw tightened. She lowered her voice further. "I shouldn't be talking." Charles waited. She glanced up the aisle, then back at him. "This isn't about you," she whispered. "Not just you." Before he could respond, a younger attendant approached from behind, pushing the cart. Ruth straightened instantly, professional mask sliding back into place. "Coffee?" the younger attendant asked Charles, voice brisk. "Yes," Charles said. "Black." The cup was placed on his tray with a quick, impersonal motion. No smile, no comment. As the cart moved on, Ruth leaned closer. "They call it optimization," she murmured. "Premium flow management." Charles's fingers tightened around the paper cup. "How long?" he asked. Ruth hesitated. "Since last summer, maybe longer." She exhaled slowly. "It started small, upgrades, downgrades, little corrections. Then the language changed." "What language?" Charles asked. She met his eyes now. "Fully. Who fits, who blends, who disrupts the experience." The words landed heavy. Ruth straightened again as another attendant passed. She gave Charles a final look. Not pleading, not dramatic, just tired. "I'm close to retirement," she said softly. "I don't scare easy anymore." Then she moved on, disappearing into the flow of the cabin. Charles stared at the coffee, steam curling upward, dissipating into nothing. Optimization, flow, experience, all the right words to hide the wrong choices. He thought of boardroom presentations, slide decks polished to perfection, charts showing retention rates, yield curves, satisfaction metrics broken down by income and loyalty tier. He remembered the meeting when Michael Grant had leaned back in his chair and said almost casually that high-value customers paid for comfort, not inconvenience. That it was the company's responsibility to understand what comfort meant. Charles had challenged him then, asked for definitions. Michael had smiled, said the market would tell them. The market always tells you something. It just doesn't tell you who pays the price. A sudden laugh burst from first class, loud and unrestrained. Someone had said something amusing. The sound floated back, hollow and distant. Charles turned his head slightly toward the curtain. He imagined Linda there, moving confidently between wide seats, her voice softer now, warmer, the version of herself reserved for people who belonged. His phone vibrated faintly in his pocket. Signal restored. He did not take it out yet. Instead, he watched. The young black man in the charcoal suit ahead of him stood abruptly, reaching for the overhead bin. An attendant appeared instantly. "Sir," she said sharp, "please remain seated." "I just need my laptop," he replied. His voice cracked slightly. "I have a meeting when we land." The attendant's eyes flicked to his suit, his face, then softened by a degree. "After service," she said, "for safety." She moved on. Moment later, a white man across the aisle stood without comment, retrieved his bag, and sat back down. No correction, no warning. Charles felt the shift in his chest again, that old, familiar pressure. He pulled out his phone. The lock screen glowed. No notifications yet. Good. He opened a secure app, one that very few people knew existed. His thumb hovered for a moment, then pressed. The screen asked for confirmation. He paused. This was the line. Once crossed, nothing stayed contained. Reputations, careers, stock prices, his own legacy. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, a sudden jolt that rattled trays and nerves alike. A few passengers gasped. Someone cursed under their breath. Charles steadied himself, fingers tightening around the phone. He pressed confirm. The app opened fully, revealing a dashboard he had not accessed in months. Operational audits, service logs, incident reports flagged and buried. Data waited, silent, patient. He began scrolling. As the aircraft cut through cloud, white filling the windows like erased memory, Charles Whitman leaned back in his seat, eyes sharp now, mind fully engaged. Whatever this was, it was bigger than a seat, and it was no longer invisible. The first anomaly appeared 3 minutes into the data stream. Charles Whitman noticed it not because it was dramatic, but because it was boring. A line item labeled Service Reassignment Adjustment scrolled past his screen, time-stamped from a flight 6 months earlier. No complaint attached, no incident report, no passenger name listed, just a coded entry, closed automatically within 90 seconds. Charles frowned. He adjusted his glasses, the cabin light reflecting faintly off the lenses, and scrolled back, then forward again. Another entry, same label, different flight, same 90-second closure window. He felt the slow tightening in his jaw. Patterns reveal themselves to people who have learned to wait. He filtered the data by route. Hub-to-hub flights first, then peak business hours, then premium-heavy routes. The screen repopulated instantly, rows stacking like quiet accusations. There were dozens, no, hundreds. His thumb slowed as he scrolled, breath steady, heart rate unchanged. This was not shock. This was confirmation. 2 seats ahead, the young man in the charcoal suit shifted again, fingers drumming against his knee. Sweat darkened the collar at the back of his neck. He glanced toward first class, then down at his watch. He looked like someone who had spent his life being told time was always running out. Charles marked that flight number mentally. He would come back to it. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, warm and practiced, announcing cruising altitude and expected arrival time. The voice carried confidence, authority, reassurance. Charles wondered how much that voice knew. He scrolled deeper. Internal notes appeared now, short, vague, sanitized. Passenger profile mismatch, experience integrity adjustment, cabin balance correction. Each phrase carefully engineered to sound reasonable in isolation. Together, they told a different story. His phone vibrated again, this time longer. A message banner appeared at the top of the screen. Audit alert acknowledged. Someone else knew he was inside the system now. Charles did not react. He had expected that. He tapped into a second layer, one buried beneath the operational dashboard, a place where comments were never meant to be seen outside senior leadership. Names began to appear. Supervisors, regional managers, a few executive initials he recognized immediately, and one name that tightened everything in his chest: Michael Grant. The COO's internal notes were brief, efficient, written in the language of someone who believed explanation was unnecessary. Maintain premium consistency. Avoid visible friction. Protect top-tier retention at all costs. At all costs. Charles leaned back slightly as the plane hummed around him, the world reduced to a narrow aluminum tube hurtling through the sky. He remembered Michael's voice from a meeting 2 years ago, calm, analytical, slightly amused. "We're not excluding anyone, Charles. We're curating an environment. People pay for separation." Charles had pushed back then, asked where the line was. Michael had smiled, said the line moved with the market. A flight attendant stopped beside Charles's row again. This time it was the younger man he had seen earlier, the one with nervous eyes. His name tag read Daniel Price. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" Daniel asked, voice a shade too careful. Charles looked up. "Water would be fine." Daniel nodded quickly, almost relieved. As he poured, his hand shook just enough to spill a drop onto the tray. "Sorry," he murmured. Charles met his eyes, held them. Daniel froze. "You've been busy today," Charles said quietly. Daniel swallowed. "Yes, sir." "Long flight," Charles continued. "Neutral. Observational." Daniel hesitated. "Yes." Behind him, Linda Harris's voice cut through the cabin from first class. "Daniel." The single word carried warning. Daniel flinched. "I'll bring the water right back," he said quickly and retreated. Charles watched him go, then returned his attention to the screen. He opened a timeline view. 14 months ago, the first coded reassignment appeared. 2 months later, the frequency doubled. 3 months after that, a new internal training module was uploaded. Premium Experience Alignment. Charles tapped it open. The file loaded slowly. Slides appeared. Clean. Corporate. Stock images of smiling passengers, champagne glasses, wide leather seats. Bullet points framed in neutral language. Understand guest expectations. Minimize perceived discomfort. Exercise professional judgment in real time. He scrolled. A slide titled Case Study appeared. The example was hypothetical, of course. Always hypothetical. A premium passenger expresses dissatisfaction with cabin composition. Staff empowered to adjust seating to preserve experience integrity. No mention of race, no mention of age, no mention of anything that could be defended or challenged, just implication. Charles felt something shift inside him. Not anger, responsibility. He closed the file. Across the aisle, a white-haired man in his 70s leaned toward his seatmate, whispering something with a laugh. He wore a veteran's cap, navy blue, faded from years of use. Charles caught the words, "back in my day," before the sentence dissolved into chuckles. Charles wondered how many times that man had been told he belonged somewhere simply because of how he looked. The turbulence returned, lighter this time, like a reminder rather than a threat. The seatbelt sign chimed back on. The cabin stilled again. Ruth Daniels reappeared at the end of the row, this time without pretense. She crouched slightly, lowering herself to Charles's eye level. "You shouldn't be looking at that," she said softly. Charles tilted the phone just enough for her to see the screen. Her breath caught. "They told us it was legal," she whispered. "They said compliance signed off." "Did they show you the paperwork?" Charles asked. Ruth shook her head. "They don't show us anything." She looked around quickly, then back at him. "You know who's behind this?" Charles nodded. "I do." Ruth's voice trembled now. "People have lost hours, shifts, promotions." Quietly, anyone who questioned it. Charles locked the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. "Names?" he asked. Ruth hesitated. Then she gave one. Then another. Then another. Each name landed with weight. "Thank you," Charles said. Ruth straightened, mask returning. "I shouldn't have said anything." "You should have," Charles replied. "And you won't be alone." She studied his face, searching for something. Reassurance, authority, truth. "You talk like someone who can do something," she said. Charles did not answer. She moved on. The plane flew on. Minutes passed. Then more. Charles sat still, hands folded now, phone untouched. The pieces were aligning in his mind, not as outrage, but as structure, systems, incentives, Silence. This was not one bad decision, this was architecture, and architecture could be dismantled. As the aircraft cut through thinning cloud and sunlight spilled back into the cabin, Charles Whitman felt the tempo of the story change. The slow burn had ended. The next phase would not be quiet. And somewhere, in an office far below, Michael Grant was about to realize that the line he thought was invisible had just been crossed. The first call went unanswered. Charles Whitman watched the screen fade to black, the name still hovering there for a second longer than it should have. Michael Grant, Chief Operating Officer, 15 years younger, brilliant on paper, ruthless in practice. Charles slid the phone back into his jacket pocket and looked up as the cabin shifted again, this time not from turbulence, but from anticipation. The plane had begun its slow descent. A subtle change in pitch, a collective tightening of posture. People preparing to arrive, to become someone else again the moment the doors opened. Across the aisle, the man in the veteran's cap adjusted it carefully, fingers lingering on the frayed brim. He stared straight ahead, jaw set, as if bracing himself for something unseen. Charles wondered if he had noticed the patterns too, or if experience had taught him not to look. The announcement came over the intercom, smooth and confident. The captain thanked everyone for flying Horizon Atlantic and reminded them to remain seated. The words sounded rehearsed, safe, familiar. Charles felt none of those things. He thought of the second call he would make. Not yet. Timing mattered. Power was not just about authority, it was about sequence. Linda Harris passed through the aisle again, this time moving quickly, clipboard tucked against her chest. She did not look at Charles, not even a flicker, but her pace betrayed her. Too fast, too controlled. She knew something was wrong. She just did not know what. The younger attendant, Daniel Price, followed behind her. His shoulders were tense, his eyes darting. When he reached Charles's row, he slowed. "Sir," Daniel said quietly, almost under his breath, "when we land, if you need assistance, there will be supervisors at the gate." Charles looked up. "Is that standard?" Daniel hesitated. "No." "What changed?" Charles asked. Daniel swallowed. "There was a call from operations." Charles nodded once. "Thank you." Daniel opened his mouth as if to say more, then closed it. He moved on, hands clenched. The descent continued. Charles reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a small leather notebook. Old habit. Analog when things got serious. He flipped it open and wrote 3 names. Ruth Daniels, Daniel Price, Mark Johnson. The people who had spoken when it would have been easier not to. Then he wrote one more. Michael Grant. The wheels touched down with a solid thud. A ripple of relief moved through the cabin. Applause broke out somewhere near the back, scattered and brief. As the plane slowed, Charles felt the shift again. Not relief. Momentum. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Immediately people stood, reaching for bags, reclaiming space. Voices rose. The illusion of equality returned as everyone crowded the aisle, bodies pressed close regardless of class or cabin. Charles stayed seated. Linda appeared at the front of the economy section, standing rigidly near the aisle, eyes scanning. She spoke quietly into her headset. Her jaw was tight enough to crack. 2 men in dark jackets waited just beyond the open aircraft door, visible through the aisle gap. Airport operations, not security. Not yet. Charles stood then, lifting his bag smoothly. As he stepped into the aisle, Linda turned sharply. "Sir," she said, "please wait." Charles looked at her, calm, unmoved. "Why?" he asked. "We have instructions," Linda replied. "You'll be escorted off the aircraft." A few heads turned, murmurs rippled. "Escorted?" Charles repeated. "For what reason?" Linda hesitated. "Just long enough. For follow-up," she said. Charles smiled, just slightly. Not warm, not friendly. "Of course," he said. "I wouldn't want to disrupt your process." He stepped forward. The men at the door straightened as he approached. One of them, broad-shouldered, early 40s, reached out reflexively, then stopped when Charles raised a hand. "No need," Charles said. "I'll walk." They fell in beside him as he stepped onto the jet bridge. The hum of the plane faded, replaced by the echoing quiet of the terminal corridor. The lead operations supervisor cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitman, we'll just need a few minutes of your time." Charles stopped walking. The supervisor blinked, surprised. "Before we continue," Charles said evenly, "I want you to understand something. What happened on that aircraft was not a service adjustment. It was a violation." The supervisor stiffened. "Sir, with respect—" "Respect," Charles interrupted, "is exactly what was missing." The supervisor glanced at his colleague, uncertain. "We're just following instructions." "From whom?" Charles asked. The supervisor hesitated, then answered, "Corporate operations." Charles nodded. "Then we'll start there." He pulled out his phone. This time when he called, the line connected immediately. Michael Grant's voice came through, smooth but strained. "Charles, I was hoping you'd wait until we spoke privately." Charles looked straight ahead at the long corridor, travelers passing without noticing the moment unfolding beside them. "You removed me from my seat," Charles said. "Without cause, without notice, without authority." Michael exhaled. "Let's not dramatize this." "Then don't minimize it," Charles replied. His voice remained calm, but the temperature dropped. "You implemented a policy that violates federal civil rights law. You did it quietly. You did it deliberately." A pause. "You don't have the full picture," Michael said carefully. "I do," Charles replied. "I'm looking at it." Silence stretched. "You opened the audit system," Michael said finally. "Yes." Another pause. Longer this time. "You were not supposed to be on that flight," Michael said. Charles almost laughed. "Almost. That," he said, "is the most honest thing you've said all day." Michael's voice hardened. "This company survives because we make difficult decisions." "This company exists," Charles replied, "because we promised something better than that." The supervisor shifted uncomfortably beside him. "We'll continue this conversation," Michael said, "with the board." "We will," Charles agreed. "Today." Michael hesitated. "Charles, think carefully. This will not end the way you think." Charles's gaze drifted to the terminal windows, where sunlight poured across polished floors, people moving freely, unaware of the lines drawn just beneath their feet. "It already has," Charles said. He ended the call. The supervisor cleared his throat again. "Sir?" Charles turned to him. "I'll need you to document everything that happened from the moment I boarded that aircraft. Every instruction you received. Every name." The supervisor hesitated. Charles met his eyes. "You can do it now," he said, "or you can explain later why you didn't." The supervisor nodded. "Yes, sir." Charles walked forward, alone now, footsteps steady, unhurried. Somewhere behind him, Linda Harris stood frozen in the jet bridge doorway, watching him go, the realization slowly dawning that the rules she had enforced were about to turn and face her. The story had moved beyond observation. It had entered consequence. The boardroom smelled like polished wood and old confidence. Charles Whitman stood at the far end of the table, jacket still folded over his arm, tie loosened but not removed. He had arrived before everyone else, not out of habit, out of intent. The room deserved to feel his presence before his words. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Denver skyline, late afternoon light cutting sharp angles across the table. The city looked calm, ordered, deceptively so. The first to enter was Karen Holt, 71, longest-serving board member, former airline counsel who had argued labor cases back when smoking was still allowed in cockpits. She stopped when she saw Charles. "You look like you've had a flight," she said. "I had a lesson," Charles replied. She studied his face, then nodded once and took her seat without another word. Others followed, one by one, familiar faces, expensive suits, controlled expressions. A few avoided eye contact. A few offered polite smiles that did not reach their eyes. Michael Grant entered last. He closed the door behind him deliberately, as if sealing the room. His posture was straight, his face composed. The faint redness at his collar betrayed the strain he was trying to suppress. "Let's begin," Michael said, moving toward his seat. "No," Charles said calmly. "Let's not." Every head turned. Charles placed his jacket on the back of a chair but did not sit. He rested both hands on the table, palms flat, grounding himself. "I'm going to speak first," he said. "Not as chairman, not as founder, as the person who sat in 18 Delta today and was told he did not belong." A murmur rippled through the room. Karen's eyes narrowed. Michael opened his mouth. Charles lifted a hand. "I'm not finished." Silence returned, heavier this time. "I spent 40 years building this company," Charles continued. His voice was even, but the words carried weight. "Not to be admired, not to be protected, but to move people with dignity. That was the promise. That was the work." He tapped the table once, soft, final. And today, that promise failed. Michael leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Charles, with respect, you're personalizing an operational matter." Charles turned his head slowly toward him. "You operationalized discrimination." Michael's jaw tightened. "That is not accurate." Charles reached into his jacket pocket and removed his phone. He did not look at it. He placed it face down on the table. "I activated an audit at cruising altitude," he said. 14 months of data, seating reassignments, profile adjustments, internal training language that avoids the word race while targeting everything that implies it. A board member near the middle shifted uncomfortably. Another crossed his arms. Karen leaned forward. "Michael," she said, "is this true?" Michael exhaled. "What's true is that we've been under unprecedented pressure. Margins are thin. Competition is ruthless. Our premium customers expect an experience." "At whose expense?" Charles asked. Michael's voice hardened. "At the expense of inefficiency." Charles shook his head slowly. "No, at the expense of people who look like problems to you." Michael stood. "That's unfair. So was removing a paying customer from first class without cause," Charles replied. "So was training staff to decide who disrupts comfort based on how they feel about a face." Michael looked around the room. "You all signed off on retention strategies. You wanted numbers. You wanted stability." Karen slammed her hand on the table. The sound cracked through the room. "We wanted lawful," she said, "and we wanted ethical." Michael turned toward her. "You think the Department of Transportation cares about ethics? They care about complaints. We reduced complaints." "By silencing them," Charles said. Michael scoffed. "By managing expectations." Charles straightened. "You don't manage expectations by erasing people." He picked up the phone and slid it across the table. "I have documentation, names, dates, recorded internal calls, testimony from crew members who were threatened with schedule cuts if they spoke up." Michael stared at the phone. For the first time, something cracked. "You don't understand what you're unleashing," he said quietly. "This will trigger investigations, shareholder panic, media frenzy." "Yes," Charles said, "it will." "And you think you'll come out clean?" Michael asked. "You were chairman while this happened." Charles nodded. "I accept that." The room went still. Karen looked at him sharply. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying accountability doesn't stop at convenience," Charles replied, "including mine." Michael laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You're going to burn the house down and stand in the ashes with a halo." "No," Charles said. "I'm going to stand there with the truth." He looked around the table, meeting each gaze in turn. "This company will survive scrutiny, or it doesn't deserve to." A long silence followed. The hum of the building's ventilation system filled the void. Karen finally spoke. "Michael Grant," she said, "effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending investigation." Michael's eyes widened. "You can't do that without a vote." Karen nodded toward the others. "All in favor?" Hands rose, slowly, reluctantly, then more. Michael looked at Charles. "You did this on a plane." "I did this by paying attention," Charles replied. Security appeared quietly at the door. Michael straightened his jacket, face pale now. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Charles agreed. "It's just begun." Michael walked out. The door closed. Charles exhaled for the first time in hours. His shoulders sagged slightly, the weight settling in. Karen stood and moved closer. "You've made enemies," she said softly. "I've made space," Charles replied, "for something better." She studied him. "You're going to be asked to step back." "I know." "And if the board votes to remove you?" Charles looked out at the city again. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows. "Then I'll leave knowing I didn't protect my seat," he said. "I protected the idea." Karen nodded slowly. "That idea may cost you everything." Charles turned back to the table. Some things should. The meeting continued long into the evening. Lawyers were called, statements drafted, timelines established. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one, and somewhere in the building, a quiet understanding settled. This was no longer about a flight. It was about whether an industry could survive being honest with itself. The news broke before Charles Whitman made it back to his hotel. A push notification lit up his phone as the elevator doors closed, sealing him inside a quiet box of mirrored steel. He did not need to open it to know. He could hear it already, the low, distant roar of a story waking up. Horizon Atlantic. Exec put on leave amid civil rights review. Charles leaned his head back against the cool metal wall and closed his eyes. The elevator hummed, a soft, indifferent sound. By the time he reached his room, 3 more alerts followed. Different outlets, different tones. The same facts bending under the weight of speculation. Words like alleged and internal surfaced alongside heavier ones. Discrimination, federal inquiry, whistleblowers. He set his jacket on the chair by the window and loosened his collar. The city below glowed with evening traffic, red and white lights threading through the streets like veins. From up here, everything looked orderly, predictable. It never was. His phone rang. Karen Holt's name filled the screen. "They're already calling for your resignation," she said without greeting. Charles exhaled slowly. "That was faster than I expected." "Shareholders don't like uncertainty," Karen replied, "and they like being embarrassed even less." "Do they like the law?" Charles asked. A pause. "Some of them," she said. He crossed the room and poured himself a glass of water, hands steady. "What about the unions?" "They've issued a statement," Karen said. "Cautious support. They're waiting to see if this is real reform or theater." "It's real," Charles said. "I know," Karen replied, "but they don't." He looked out the window again. Somewhere down there, crews were working overnight shifts, fueling planes, loading bags, moving the unseen machinery that made everything else possible. "And the board?" he asked. "Split," Karen said. "Half think you've done the right thing. Half think you've made yourself the story." Charles smiled faintly. "I always was." Karen's voice softened. "Charles, you should prepare yourself. The investigation won't be clean. They'll go back years. They'll ask why you didn't see it sooner." "They should," Charles said. "So should I." Another pause. "You don't sound surprised." "I'm not," he said. "I just wish it hadn't taken this." After the call ended, the room felt too quiet. Charles sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed his hands together slowly. His knuckles ached. He noticed it only now, the way the adrenaline had masked small things. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. "You don't know me. I'm a baggage handler in St. Louis. 32 years. Thank you for today." Charles stared at the message for a long moment. Then another arrived. "My father was removed from first class last year. He never complained. Said it wasn't worth it." It was. Another. "I almost quit last winter. Glad I didn't." He set the phone down gently as if it were something fragile. The next morning came without ceremony. Coffee tasted bitter. The shower ran too hot. The mirror reflected a man who looked older than he had a week ago. Not weaker, just worn in new places. By 8 o'clock, the calls began again. Lawyers, advisors. A former colleague who spoke carefully, as if each word were being recorded. The Department of Transportation requested formal documentation. The Civil Rights Division followed shortly after. Horizon Atlantic's legal team scrambled, issuing statements that said much and promised little. Charles sat through it all, listening more than speaking. At noon, he left the hotel and walked 2 blocks to a small diner. He chose a booth by the window, back straight, hands folded. The waitress, late 50s, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck. "What'll it be, hun?" she asked. "Coffee," Charles said. "Black." She poured and lingered a second longer than necessary. "You're that airline guy," she said. Charles met her eyes. "I am." She nodded. "My brother flies freight, says this industry eats its own." A beat. "You trying to change that?" "I'm trying to stop pretending it doesn't," Charles said. She smiled faintly. "Good luck." As she walked away, Charles noticed a man at the counter watching him. Mid-60s, union jacket, calloused hands wrapped around a mug. The man raised his cup slightly in acknowledgement. Charles returned the gesture. By the end of the week, the pressure had found new forms. An editorial questioned whether a chairman who failed to catch systemic bias should be trusted to fix it. A financial analyst warned that cultural overcorrection could alienate premium customers. An old friend called to suggest, gently, that stepping aside might protect the company he loved. That night, Charles sat alone in his home office, papers spread across the desk. Old photographs lined the shelves, his father in uniform, his mother smiling despite exhaustion. A younger Charles, standing beside the first leased aircraft, arm around a mechanic whose name he could no longer remember. He picked up the photo and studied it. His phone rang again. This time it was Ruth Daniels. "They pulled me off the schedule," she said quietly. Charles closed his eyes. "I'm sorry." "They said it was temporary," Ruth continued. "Administrative review. They shouldn't have done that," Charles said. "I knew they would," she replied. "I just needed you to know." "You did the right thing," he said. She laughed softly. "That's what everyone says when the consequences show up." "I won't let this stand," Charles said. "I know," Ruth replied. "That's why I called you, not to complain, to remind you." "Of what?" "That this isn't about winning," she said. "It's about not going back." After the call, Charles sat very still. Outside, a plane roared overhead, its lights blinking through the dark. He thought of the veteran's cap, the young man in the charcoal suit, the quiet way people had learned to shrink themselves to fit someone else's idea of comfort. The board meeting scheduled for Monday loomed in his mind. There would be motions, votes, legal advice wrapped in concern. He knew the outcome was no longer fully in his control. And for the first time since the story broke, that thought did not terrify him. It steadied him. Because whatever happened next, the silence had already been broken. And silence, once lost, never truly comes back. The hearing room was smaller than Charles Whitman expected. No grand chamber, no dramatic architecture. Just a rectangular space with beige walls, a long table, and microphones positioned with bureaucratic indifference. The kind of room where lives were altered quietly, without applause or ceremony. He arrived early again. Outside the narrow windows, Washington moved on as it always did. Traffic, footsteps, coffee cups in gloved hands, democracy, functioning on schedule. Charles took his seat, placed his folder on the table, and waited. The Department of Transportation officials entered first. 2 men, 1 woman, all mid-career, all careful. They greeted him politely, professionally, with the restrained neutrality of people trained not to reveal opinion. Then came the attorneys. Horizon Atlantic's legal team filed in behind him, suits sharp, expressions tight. They did not sit beside him, not anymore. They took seats just far enough away to signal distance without declaring it. Across the room, representatives from the Civil Rights Division settled in. Quiet, observant. One of them, a black woman in her late 40s, met Charles's eyes and gave a slight nod. Not approval, recognition. The door opened again. Michael Grant entered. He looked different now, thinner, less polished. The confidence was still there, but it had sharpened into something brittle. He did not look at Charles as he took his seat. The chairwoman cleared her throat. This hearing is to determine whether Horizon Atlantic Airlines engaged in discriminatory practices in violation of federal law. The words were procedural. The weight was not. Charles listened as the timeline unfolded. Dates, policies, emails read aloud in neutral voices. Each sentence stripped of emotion, reduced to facts. He felt the oddest thing as he listened. Relief. Not because it was easy, because it was finally honest. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he stood smoothly, hands resting on the table, voice controlled. "Our intent was never to discriminate," Michael said. "Our intent was to preserve service quality in a highly competitive market." The phrase landed flat. He continued, "Any adjustments made were based on customer feedback, not personal characteristics." Charles watched the faces across the table. Some nodded, others did not. Then the civil rights attorney spoke. "Mr. Grant," she said, voice calm, "can you explain why service reassignment adjustments disproportionately affected passengers over 60 and passengers of color, even when ticket class and loyalty status were identical?" Michael hesitated. "Just a fraction. Our data models account for multiple variables," he replied. "Correlation does not imply causation." The attorney nodded. "No, but pattern does." She gestured toward the screen. Graphs appeared. Clean, unforgiving. Silence settled over the room. Michael's jaw tightened. When it was Charles's turn, he did not stand immediately. He took a breath first. Slow, measured. Then he rose. "I'm not here to defend my company," he said. "I'm here to explain how it failed." A ripple moved through the room. "I approved strategies I did not interrogate deeply enough," Charles continued. "I trusted reports that were designed to reassure rather than reveal. That's on me." Michael turned toward him sharply. Charles did not look back. "But accountability does not end with awareness," Charles said. "It begins there." He described the flight, the seat, the language used, the quiet efficiency of being moved without explanation. "I've spent my life believing systems reflect the values of the people who build them," he said. "What I saw was a system that had learned how to hide its values behind metrics." The room remained still. "I won't pretend this was one bad actor," Charles continued. "It wasn't. It was comfort, convenience, silence, mine included." He sat. The chairwoman folded her hands. "Thank you, Mr. Whitman." The hearing adjourned without resolution. That would come later. Recommendations, fines, mandates, oversight. Outside, reporters waited, microphones raised like weapons. Charles did not stop. By the time he reached the steps, his phone buzzed again. Karen Holt. "The board is meeting," she said, "without you." Charles nodded to himself. "I expected that." "They're voting on your position," Karen continued. "There's pressure to show decisive action." "Decisive doesn't always mean correct," Charles said. Karen's voice softened. "You know how this ends, don't you?" "Yes," Charles replied. "I just don't know when." That night, Charles returned home alone. He cooked a simple meal, sat at his kitchen table, listened to the quiet hum of his house settling around him. No cameras, no advisors, just the echo of choices made. He opened his laptop and drafted a letter, not to the board, to the employees. He wrote slowly, choosing each word with care. He wrote about dignity, about mistakes, about what would change and what would take time. He did not promise comfort. He promised truth. When he finished, he did not send it. Not yet. The vote came the next morning. Karen's voice was steady when she called. "They've asked you to step down as chairman," she said. "Remain as founder emeritus. Advisory only." Charles closed his eyes. "And if I refuse?" he asked. "They'll remove you," Karen replied, publicly. A pause. "What would you like me to do?" she asked. Charles walked to the window. Outside, a delivery truck idled at the curb. A man jumped down, stretching his back before unloading boxes. work continuing. "Tell them I accept," Charles said. Karen inhaled sharply. "Are you sure?" "Yes," he replied. "The work doesn't stop because my title does." After the call ended, Charles sent the letter. Within hours, responses flooded in. Some angry, some grateful, some afraid. All real. As the sun set that evening, Charles Whitman sat on his porch watching the sky darken. He had lost power, but the truth had gained it, and that, he knew, was a trade he could live with. The changes did not arrive with banners or speeches. They arrived quietly, in meetings that ran long, in policies rewritten line by line, in uncomfortable training sessions where no one was allowed to hide behind euphemism anymore. Charles Whitman watched it all from the outside. Founder Emeritus was a ceremonial title. It came with an office he rarely used and an email address that no longer copied him by default. Invitations arrived late, if at all. Decisions moved forward without his name attached. That was the price. The board appointed an interim leadership team within weeks. Public statements emphasized renewal, accountability, partnership. Lawyers worked overtime. Consultants flooded in with binders and confidence. A federal monitor was assigned, quiet but relentless, embedded deep inside operations. The real work happened lower, on the ground, at crew bases, at check-in counters, in training rooms that smelled like burnt coffee and carpet cleaner. Mandatory sessions replaced optional ones. Scenarios were no longer hypothetical. Names were not changed. Age, race, disability, accent were spoken aloud, not hinted at. Some employees bristled. Some crossed their arms and stared at the floor. Others listened in stunned silence, hearing their own experiences finally described without apology. A senior captain walked out of one session and never returned. He cited personal reasons. Everyone knew better. At the St. Louis base, Ruth Daniels was called back to work. Not with an apology, with paperwork. She returned to the cabin she had worked for nearly 3 decades, her name now attached to a new role, crew liaison. It was not glamorous. It was not comfortable. It meant sitting across from managers half her age and asking questions no one liked. She accepted anyway. Mark Johnson, the veteran flight attendant, was transferred to training. He did not want the job. He wanted the air. But he took it, standing in front of younger crews and telling stories that had never made it into manuals. Some listened, some didn't. Change does not ask permission. Charles received updates through back channels, texts, calls late at night, short messages that carried exhaustion and cautious hope. Not everything worked. One premium customer threatened to sue after being told no seat reassignment would be made based on personal preference. A shareholder demanded a reversal of policy. A columnist mocked the airline for turning planes into classrooms. Revenue dipped again. The board flinched. Charles stayed silent. The hardest moment came 3 months in. A regional manager resigned publicly, accusing the company of abandoning its core customers. The media amplified it. Headlines sharpened. Commentators debated whether dignity was a luxury the industry could afford. That night, Charles sat alone in his study and reread his father's discharge papers. Honorable service. Quiet language. No mention of what had been endured to earn it. He folded the papers carefully and put them back. Across the country, small things shifted. A gate agent stopped a colleague mid-sentence and said, "That's not okay." A flight attendant chose explanation over authority. A supervisor hesitated before making a call they once would have made without thinking. None of it made the news. 6 months after the hearing, Charles was invited to testify again. This time, not as a defendant, but as a witness to reform. He declined the spotlight and sent Ruth instead. She stood before the panel, hands steady, voice calm. "This didn't change because someone was punished," she said. "It changed because silence stopped working." The room listened. By the end of the year, other airlines began to ask questions. Quiet ones, off the record. Consultants shared frameworks. Training modules were requested, borrowed, adapted. No one said reshape the industry out loud, but the shape was changing. Charles noticed it the next time he flew. He booked economy, by choice. No one recognized him. That was fine. A young attendant offered him water and smiled, not as protocol, but as habit. An older man across the aisle struggled with his bag. Another passenger helped without being asked. Small kindnesses, unremarkable unless you knew how easily they disappeared under pressure. As the plane leveled off, Charles looked out the window at the clouds stretched beneath them like an unbroken field. He felt lighter than he had in years. Not because he had won, because something had been set in motion that did not require him anymore. That was how change lasted. Time did what headlines could not. It slowed everything down. A year passed, then another. The investigations closed quietly, not with absolution, but with requirements. Oversight committees, reporting obligations, penalties that stung but did not destroy. Horizon Atlantic survived, thinner at first, then steadier. Charles Whitman watched from a distance. His days took on a different rhythm now. Morning walks, long breakfasts, occasional calls from people who no longer needed permission to speak plainly. He no longer scanned dashboards or sat through earnings briefings. Instead, he listened. At first, the silence unnerved him. For decades, his life had been measured in departures and arrivals, in routes opened and closed, in the constant forward pull of momentum. Now there was space, unscheduled time, empty afternoons. It took him months to understand that space was not absence. It was transition. One afternoon, he drove to a small airport outside Memphis, unannounced. No assistance, no press, just a rental car and a familiar ache in his knees as he walked across the tarmac. A maintenance crew was working on a narrow-body jet, panels open, tools spread across the concrete. A man in his late 50s wiped his hands on a rag and looked up. "Can I help you?" the man asked. "I hope so," Charles replied. "I'm looking for someone who remembers how this place used to run." The man squinted at him, then laughed softly. "Aren't we all?" They talked for an hour, about shortcuts that used to be taken, about pressure from above, about the relief of not having to guess what management wanted anymore. "They tell us the rules are the rules now," the man said. "Same for everyone." Charles nodded. "How does that feel?" The man considered it. "Clear," he said. "I can work with clear." At a crew base in Phoenix, Charles sat in on a training session at the back of the room. He did not speak. He did not introduce himself. He watched faces as scenarios unfolded. Discomfort, resistance, recognition. One young attendant raised her hand. "What if a passenger demands a reassignment and threatens to complain?" The trainer did not hesitate. "Then they can complain," she said. "We document it and move on." Murmurs followed, uneasy, but grounded. Afterward, the trainer approached Charles. "You've got a familiar face," she said. Charles smiled. "I get that sometimes." The industry shifted in quieter ways, too. Regulators updated guidance, not dramatically, not with speeches, just revised language that removed ambiguity. Airlines adjusted manuals. Legal teams rewrote disclaimers. A conference in Chicago dedicated a panel to service equity. The room was half full. That was progress. Not everyone adapted. An executive at a rival airline was caught on a leaked call, complaining that the market had become too sensitive. He resigned weeks later, not because of outrage, because the board had learned what risk looked like now. Charles read about it in the paper and folded the page carefully. He thought of Michael Grant sometimes. The man had disappeared from the public eye. No interviews, no think pieces, just a quiet consulting role somewhere overseas, according to rumor. Charles did not take pleasure in that. He took responsibility for it. Power always leaves marks, even when you release it. One evening, Charles attended a small community forum at a veterans hall in Ohio. No banners, just folding chairs and bad coffee. He had been invited by a retired pilot who had flown for Horizon Atlantic for 30 years. A woman stood and spoke about her husband, who had stopped flying after an incident that left him humiliated and silent. A young man talked about choosing a different career after seeing how his father was treated at work. Their stories were not dramatic. They were steady, real, Charles listened. When it was his turn, he did not stand behind the podium. "I can't undo what happened," he said. "I can tell you why I didn't see it sooner, and why I should have." Someone asked if the changes would last. Charles answered honestly, "Only if people keep insisting they do." The room was quiet after that. Later, outside under flickering streetlights, the retired pilot shook his hand. "You lost a lot," the man said. Charles nodded. "I did." "You gained something too," the pilot replied. "You just won't see it on a balance sheet." Charles drove home thinking about that. On a flight months later, seated near the back again, he watched a gate agent calmly refuse a request that would have once been granted without thought. The passenger grumbled. The line moved. No one else noticed. Charles smiled to himself. This was how industries changed, not with declarations, but with repetition. In a quiet moment, Charles opened his old notebook and flipped through pages filled with names and dates from the beginning of the story. Some had faded. Some still felt sharp. He added one more line at the bottom of the page. Not done. He closed the notebook. The plane descended through low cloud, sunlight breaking through in brief flashes. As the runway came into view, Charles felt the familiar hum beneath his feet. The honest machinery, still carrying people where they needed to go. He rested his head back and closed his eyes, knowing that whatever came next, the industry would never quite return to what it had been. And that was enough. The morning Horizon Atlantic reopened its flagship route. The terminal smelled like coffee and floor polish, and rain carried in on coats from the curb. It was ordinary in the way moments of consequence often are, hidden behind routine. Charles Whitman arrived early, not escorted, not announced. He stood near a window where the glass trembled faintly as a jet pushed back from the gate, the sound low and familiar, a pulse he had lived inside for most of his adult life. He watched passengers move, couples arguing quietly, a man helping his wife with her bag, a gate agent kneeling to speak at eye level with a child who looked afraid of flying. None of them noticed Charles. That mattered. The announcement came soft and steady, the way announcements should. Boarding would begin shortly. There were no special lanes, no whispered favors. The line formed because people understood where to stand, not because they were told they mattered more. When the door opened, Charles boarded last. Inside the aircraft, the air felt different. Not the seats or the lighting, but the absence of tension, the way shoulders were not braced, the way voices did not drop when uniforms approached. The crew moved with calm precision. Their eyes met passengers without calculation. They smiled when it was natural. They stepped back when it was not. Charles took a seat near the aisle, midway down. He did not choose first class. He had not for a long time. A man across from him struggled with the overhead bin. A flight attendant approached, older, gray threaded through her hair, movements unhurried. She waited until the man looked at her before helping. No rush, no judgment. When the bag was settled, she nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement of shared effort. As the cabin filled, Charles noticed something else. The way people watched each other less. The way the quiet did not feel fragile. At cruising altitude, the service began. The rhythm was familiar, but the tone was not. Requests were met with clarity, not appeasement. Boundaries were firm, not defensive. When a man in the forward rows raised his voice over a missing drink, the response was calm and unyielding. The attendant listened, apologized once, corrected the error, and did not shrink. Charles felt a tightening in his chest, the release that comes when you realize a burden you carried was not yours alone. Mid-flight, a woman approached his row, holding a folded card. She hesitated, then spoke. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said. "Are you Charles Whitman?" He nodded. "I thought so," she said. "My brother worked for Horizon for years. He left after an incident that made him feel small. He's back now, says it's different." Charles accepted the card, his fingers steady. "I'm glad," he said. She smiled, relieved, and returned to her seat. The descent was smooth. When the wheels touched down, there was no applause, just the soft, collective exhale of arrival. As the plane taxied, the captain's voice came over the intercom, measured and warm. He thanked the crew. He thanked the passengers. He did not thank tiers or statuses. He did not separate gratitude. As people stood and reached for bags, movement was patient. No one rushed past. No one guarded space with elbows. A small thing, maybe, but Charles had learned that systems reveal themselves in small things. At the gate, a line formed for exit. Charles waited. A young man in front of him turned and offered a brief smile. "Good flight," he said. "Yes," Charles replied, "it was." Outside the terminal, sunlight spilled across the concrete, bright and unremarkable. Reporters waited beyond a rope, cameras lifted, hungry for a moment. Charles walked past them without stopping. He had said what needed to be said already. Repetition would only cheapen it. In the days that followed, numbers came in. Not the kind that screamed success, not the kind that promised comfort. The kind that told a quieter story. Fewer complaints, fewer escalations, lower turnover among frontline staff. A modest dip in premium upgrades offset by fuller cabins elsewhere. Stability. The board met. There were arguments. There always are. Charles listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, he did not plead. He reminded them that fear is expensive and clarity is not. One director resigned. Another stayed and changed. The rest learned the shape of the new ground beneath their feet. Weeks later, an envelope arrived at Charles's home. Inside was a letter written in careful block handwriting. It was from a retired gate agent in Milwaukee. She wrote about a rule she had enforced for years without understanding why it felt wrong. She wrote about sleeping better now. She wrote thank you, not for the policy, but for the permission. Charles placed the letter in the drawer with the others. He did not reread them often. He did not need to. On a quiet Sunday, he returned to the airport where it had started, not to confront anything, but to observe. He sat near the same gate, coffee cooling in his hand. A supervisor coached a new hire through a difficult conversation, voice low, posture open. The new hire nodded, breathed, tried again. Charles stood to leave, satisfied. As he walked toward the exit, the terminal reflected back at him, glass and movement and purpose. It was not perfect. It never would be. But it was aligned. Outside, the sound of engines rose and fell, steady as a heartbeat. Charles paused, hand on the railing, and allowed himself a moment of stillness. He had not fixed the world. He had not erased harm. He had done something narrower and harder. He had changed a direction. He turned and walked away, leaving the airport to its work, trusting the people inside it to keep doing theirs. If this story moved you, stay with us by hitting like, subscribe for more, and comment "Dignity always wins."